So today is the big day. And I say that because of all of the elements of self leadership and team leadership, the one that I enjoy teaching the most and the one that I am called to speak on the most is the element of self compassion. Now, why is that? Self compassion is what helps you get back on the horse. It's what helps you um, recover from adversity or helps you get through it with resilience. Self compassion is an amazing, absolutely amazing tool that I have seen change the lives of individuals and organizations as a whole. And it's really crazy and fun for me to teach because it's completely paradoxical, right? You don't think of self compassion as a motivator, kind of like self acceptance, but it absolutely is a motivator. And the research shows us all about that. So, are you ready to dig in? I am. Okay. So, in the elements of self leadership, this is number four. And we put this after self governance because you may have logged in today and felt a little bit less than excited about your progress last week. Oftentimes, and this may not be the case for you, but oftentimes when we have people who are taking this course set action steps for themselves, especially when they get to self governance. They're really excited to make a change. They're really excited to pull themselves back into balance. And they find that changing that habit is really difficult. And they start beating themselves up about it. And that doesn't do any good for you. Remember that stress bucket that we talked about last week, or the chronic stress versus acute stress? So when you try to make those little changes and you struggle with it and then you beat yourself up about it, that just adds to chronic stress. That's the opposite of what we want. But if instead you approach it with self compassion, you can actually lower that stress bucket, I call it, or reduce your chronic stress and get back to that higher brain function. So that's the reason why we put it after self governance. So Sheryl Sandberg says self compassion is how we recover. And I love this quote because the fact is failure is inevitable. It's an inevitable part of achieving success in the long run. You have to learn from trial and error. And self-compassion is how we learn quickly and agilely and get back on into the groove fast, which is really what we want to be able to do in a business environment and what we want to be able to do collectively. So today we're going to define self-compassion. Again, talk about what it is and what is it not. We're going to put it into practice and talk about what it looks like when self-compassion is in balance and what it looks like when self-compassion is just way out of balance. And why does this matter? Why is it important for leadership? You may be asking yourself that question right now. I will show you, I promise. And then how do we integrate it? How do you start practicing it right now? Because self-compassion is a practice. So a lot of people think that self-compassion is like eating tubs of ice cream, entire pizzas, or getting hammered when you had a rough day, among other things. Okay, they think that it's self-indulgence or enabling oneself to stay where you are and not progress, giving up on life. Kind of like the definition that most people associate with self-acceptance. But self-compassion is the opposite of that. It is not that at all. Self-compassion is the act of creating an internal state of psychological safety. And you create that internal state so that you can maintain resiliency in the face of adversity. Someone who has created an internal state of psychological safety through self compassion, that is a person who knows that no matter what comes their way, they can handle it. And that is power. And that is power as a leader, and it helps people trust you and want to follow you. Now, you may have been raised by an overly strict parent. You may have been, encountered a friend's overly strict parent, or maybe you saw one on TV. But this kind of parent is makes up the majority of our inner monologue where we don't have enough self-compassion for ourselves. And let's face it, that's the majority of us, okay? And this is when every single tiny little mistake you make turns into this harsh lecture, and this kind of punitive, like, shaming about, well, you should have done this differently, how could you have done that? You know better, or like, well, you just need to study more, that sort of thing. And the way that it's said leaves you feeling, you know, unworthy of love and affection, But more importantly, it makes you feel like in order to get love and affection, you have to do everything perfectly, or you have to achieve, or you have to do everything right. So instead of experiencing that unconditional love and acceptance for who you are, you feel like you have to do A, B, and C and meet all your objectives and do it perfectly in the right time to get the kind of love that you want from your caretaker. And that's the internal state that many of us create for ourselves. So instead, we want to develop an internal state that looks more like a moderate, a loving parent. Sometimes you screw up in life, and you know that your parents will still love you and have your back, that you mess up, you're flawed. And that doesn't mean that that parent is going to stop loving you. Sorry, I love this video. This video cracks me up. She's like, Nana, I am pregnant. She's like, oh, it is okay, darling. I will help care for your baby. I raised her in the old country. I have no idea what accent that was, but every time I watch this video, it's what it reminds me of. She's like, I don't know how it happened. Anyway, sorry. Okay, so what are some examples in the workplace where you will commonly see people or see yourself struggle with self compassion? All right, we kind of mentioned it before, but failure is absolutely one of those areas where when you fail, or when you collectively fail, that there is a lot of emphasis on the failure. What went wrong? Who is to blame? Why did it go wrong? How could it possibly have gone wrong? I can't believe that it went wrong. And this is also where we can struggle with self-acceptance. There definitely is some overlap between self-acceptance and self-compassion, but I think of self-acceptance as more of like a starting place, and self compassion is more of a way to recover. We also, when you have a colleague who's withdrawn, or you yourself feel withdrawn, often, or when I see this with my clients, I often ask them, how can you give yourself a little bit of a break here? Because typically they're withdrawing because something within them says that they are not up to the task. That the adversity that they're facing, or the project that they're facing, is too overwhelming for them. So instead of engaging in it, they're just like, I don't even know where to start, and they withdraw. Self compassion can be a really helpful tool here to say, all right, it's not going to be perfect, right? So you're not going to get it all done at once. Where can we start to chip off some pieces here? And also unfairness. When unfairness pops up in the workplace, maybe someone got a raise, and you don't think that they were deserving of it, you can start to really beat yourself up. Well, I should have advocated for myself. I should have done this. I should have done that differently. Or, you kind of constantly are comparing yourself to that person as a metric of success, which is really unhealthy, as opposed to just looking at your own behavior, and just trying to do better the next day, and even knowing that the next day might not always be better. So unfairness is a place where it pops up a lot too. So here are some really interesting studies, and there are many, many more where this came from, but just three for you today. So self compassion, again, it is a paradox. Studies are showing that self compassion is paradoxically motivating to improve personal weaknesses. You would think that it would say, all right, well, personal weaknesses, I don't need to worry about it. But that self love, that self care that you develop for yourself when you have compassion, you want to care for that person. You see that that person is worthy of being cared for, even in their flawed state, and so you do more to improve yourself. It's totally it's hard to comprehend, but we think that the reason why it does that, the reason why it's paradoxical, is because it physiologically soothes your stress response. So they've tested people before and after acts of self-compassion, and they've shown that after self-compassion, or people who are higher in trait self-compassion, they see a decrease in physiological stress like salivary cortisol, decrease in heart rate, decrease in blood pressure, and an increase in heart rate variability, which is a sign of wellness. So what's really cool is that, you know, studies are showing that there is your body physically changes as a result of self-compassion, which is also super cool, because if it's putting you in that, if it's taking away the stress and putting you in that place of safety, then that means you're going to have access to higher brain function, like we talked about last week. So this is an amazing, amazing tool. And it also promotes resiliency, because you can bounce back. You know that if you regret something, all right, next thing. If you feel like you have a failure, all right, that is part of life. It sucks, but it's normal. How can I be kind to myself and move forward? And we're going to talk about that formula that you can follow so you can start to integrate it right now. So, what does self compassion look like when it's out of balance, when you're doing this to yourself every day in the mirror? You know, um, you probably, if self compassion is out of balance, when I'm listening to a client and asking myself if self compassion is out of balance for that client, I typically hear them say the word should a lot. And I mean a lot. I know that I should just be doing this. I know I should just be doing that, and when this element of self leadership is out of balance, you will be reminding yourself what you should be doing or should not be doing often. And that leaves you with a sense of feeling really inadequate. Like, well, why can't I just rise to the occasion? Why can't I just do it? It's similar to what we were talking about last week with self-governance, but this is really like a sense of feeling toward yourself, of feeling inadequate for not being able to do it. And that also tends to make you really judgmental of other people's inadequacies too, because you kind of hold them to that same impossible standard that you're holding yourself to. It can also make you very risk averse, which we've talked about in previous modules, but I think that it's especially people who are out of balance and self compassion are especially prone to it because you're really harsh with yourself when mistakes are made, like that overly strict parent, and very prone to perfectionism because there's this fear, right, that if I don't do everything perfect, that I'm not going to be worthy. And when you're risk averse, you also tend to respond very poorly to criticism because when you do take a risk and it doesn't go so well and someone criticizes you, you really, really take that to heart and feel a sense of guilt or shame about it. That's what that looks like when it's out of balance. And I commonly experience clients who have a really mean inner jerk. That overly strict, kind of mean, punitive parent has become your inner monologue and it has become a trait. So you often are just you go to the extreme of it and you insult yourself, you demean yourself, you take everything personally and you hyper focus on personal shortcomings. And by taking everything personally, in this sense, I also mean that you tell yourself stories about how other people are showing up. Well, they just think this, they just think that. So even if somebody didn't do anything directly mean to you, or you still take it, you still take behaviors that you think might be insulting to you. It's very, very personally. And so you end up overly sensitive, both because of your own inner voice and the voice that you imagine other people are thinking about you. You'll also probably feel pretty unmotivated. Like we talked about earlier, that sense of feeling withdrawn. You feel overwhelmed, you don't know where to start, and it's because problems feel unsolvable. Right? Because you can't fix it all at one time and you can't be kind enough with yourself to let yourself grow slowly over time to make mistakes and to recognize that you still have inherent value anyway. So what does it look like when self-compassion is in balance? This is life goals right here, okay? So when self-compassion is in balance, you feel really curious about life, like in that beautiful childlike way, where you're focusing on improvement instead of the ultimate objectives. You're like, okay, yes, this mountain seems really big, this seems like a really, really big undertaking. So where can I start? Where's a good starting point for me where I can get a handle on this? And you enjoy the experience of the growth and the change that it affects within you. And you like to test new habits and behaviors because you're not worried about failing. You know that you'll bounce back. And it makes you really resilient when major, major horrible things go wrong in your life. It's easier for you to accept the setbacks as part of your overall growth and view opportunities, failures as opportunities to learn. I call it post-traumatic growth syndrome. And you recognize that the adversity is only temporary. So it gives you that sense of hope that you're going to make it through in the end and can still find joy and happiness in your life. And instead of having an inner jerk, you start to over time replace that inner jerk with a voice of your inner cheerleader, which I think I said last time. It may sound cheesy, but it's true. It's an encouraging inner voice reminding you to go, try, you've got this, it's okay, try again. You look for the positive attributes. You're like, yeah, you did a great job. Good tackle. If you think of an actual cheerleader, get back up, you can do this. And you focus on leveraging your strengths. You recognize your strengths, you own your strengths, you look for opportunities to use those strengths instead of constantly playing the underdog and trying to improve your weaknesses. You just manage your weaknesses and you leverage your strengths. It's a very, very different voice. And I want to pause here and say that I, as a rule, teach clients who have a strong inner voice to find a voice of the inner cheerleader. Maybe it's like the voice of their best friend, and to actively, in their mind, like a crazy person, talk back to the inner jerk. Because over time, that inner cheerleader voice will kind of kick the inner jerk out of there, and then you'll primarily be left with that encouraging inner cheerleader, that loving and moderate parent who will take care of your child if you get pregnant out of wedlock. Okay, so it's also very motivating, which we saw earlier from the studies, and that's because you trust yourself. You feel gratification from hard work and from growth, and you know that you can get back up again when you trip and fall. And you set small obtainable goals so you can thrive off of them and see yourself moving forward and celebrate each little micro achievement. Self compassion is very, very motivating. And it's because it's a lot of self love toward yourself, self care. And it sounds like, okay, when I fall short of my objective, I'm in tune with my emotions and I'm kind to myself. So let's rewind. When you showed up today for this module, maybe you fell short of your objective or fell short of the action step that you set for this week. And self compassion is about being in tune with how you feel about that, recognizing that that happens sometimes, and choosing to be kind to yourself. And that can actually help you move forward faster. It's really, really cool. I see it happen all the time with executives. So, how does this happen with leadership? This is where it gets really exciting. So, who would you rather work for? Would you rather work for someone who's obsessed with the objectives, obtaining a goal, or prioritizes improvement and growth and that sense of curiosity? Do you want to work for someone who really harshly reacts to failures and points out all of your flaws, like that really strict parent, or who views failures as learning opportunities and says, okay, we did this, now what? Let's grow. Kind of, who also believes in that self-acceptance piece, but especially when failures happen. Do you want someone who's critical, like I said a second ago, always just pointing out everything that's wrong with you and your work, or someone who's encouraging, who sees the what you do well and wants to help you do more of it? Do you want to work for someone who focuses on mistakes and shortcomings, or who focuses on positive attributes? Who fears failure and is risk averse, or sees adversity as temporary and quite frankly inevitable? And do you want to work for someone who feels easily overwhelmed and you can tell, and then you don't really feel like they have things under control, or feels that sense of gratification from hard work and digging in and getting a job done, or working toward getting a job done? And here's the thing, like I know that I'm talking about a leader addressing these things toward you, but the things that we do to ourselves often leak out toward others. And that's why the self leadership piece is so important, because if they're compassionate with themselves, they're going to model that, and they're going to help you be compassionate with yourself, and then everybody rises. So self compassion is absolutely essential for the rest of our leadership program. It's essential for self validation because a lot of people don't validate themselves unless they're 100% all the time. They don't acknowledge where they're doing something really awesome and affirm themselves if it's not absolutely perfect. And self compassion helps set you up for self validation because it reminds you that things don't have to be perfect to be good. It also absolutely helps you with empathy and with gratitude, right? Because you start to see the good in others and the good in yourselves as opposed to the shortcomings. And you're able to connect with yourself in a deeper way, which allows you to connect with others, which inevitably allows for more clarity, more think sync, which we'll talk about later, and for setting boundaries because self-compassion helps you recognize your needs, prioritize your self-care and be kind to yourself and communicate your needs with others. So let's review. And then I'm going to give you some really solid takeaways and tips for today. So self-compassion is not self-indulgence or enabling yourself to continue a bad behavior, or I shouldn't say a bad behavior. The end I just said should. um, to continue a behavior that doesn't serve you and your ultimate objectives. It's more about creating that sense of inner psychological safety to maintain that resiliency in the face of adversity, to feel like you, no matter what happens, you got this. And when we're in balance with self-compassion, we're curious, resilient. Our inner voice is it cheers us on and is encouraging, and we feel motivated and very engaged. And when it's out of balance, we're shooting ourselves. We don't want to take risks. We feel risk averse. We feel very uncomfortable being out of our element. We have a voice that's a total jerk, an inner voice that just beats ourselves up all the time and points out all of our flaws, and we feel unmotivated or withdrawn. We don't want to engage because we don't know if we can handle it, or it feels overwhelming or like it's too much. And again, it sounds like when I fall short of my objective, I'm in tune with my emotions and kind to myself. We're going to get more specific about that in a second. But so far, let's check in with our learning objectives. Okay, so we've talked about, we've defined self compassion. We've talked about what it is and what it is not. And we have looked at what it feels like in practice, or when it's in balance or out of balance. And we've talked about why it matters for leadership. So now let's talk about integrating it. So, first, I'm going to ask you some of the questions from our coaching toolkit. And again, these are going to be on the questions page in the next lesson after you complete this video. But, I want you to ask yourself, who is someone in your life who encourages and supports you? Maybe a best friend, maybe your mom, maybe you have a moderate and loving parent. And if you can't think of somebody, make someone up. I don't care who it is, your pretend ideal grandma who will take care of your baby if you get pregnant out of wedlock. And then, ask yourself, what does your inner jerk most often harass you about? If you're like me, you will know instantly. Back when I used to be 90 pounds heavier, which you may not know because I haven't talked about that yet in this program, my inner jerk would obviously harass me the most about my weight and how my body looked. And guess what helped the most and helped me lose 90 pounds? Self compassion. I promise you, it works to help you meet your goals and objectives, especially the really big ones. But I want you to ask yourself, what does your inner jerk most often harass you about? And it might be a few things. And then ask yourself, what would your support person, your encouraging person, your inner cheerleader, or your best friend say back to your inner jerk? How would it defend you? How would that person, stick up for you? And that is if creates the framework or a starting place for the dialogue that I'm hoping you can engage in throughout the week when you see that inner jerk pop up in your head. This can change your life. I hope you're ready for it. So this part that these steps in compassion that I want to give you as a tool are adapted from Kristen Neff. She did all of the primary research on self-compassion, and these are the three components that are responsible for that stress reduction, that physiological stress reduction that we talked about earlier. And I've adapted them, just for what feels natural to me in my coaching engagements with my clients. But first, when you're really feeling that inner jerk pop up, or you've had a setback, or you're having a really hard time getting over something, first you want to label the emotions. Okay, what emotions do I feel? And you don't want to exaggerate these. I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling ignored, I'm feeling whatever. They need to be emotions. You want them to be emotions for this to be beneficial, and you want them to be, as accurate as possible to how you're feeling. And then normalize it. Is it normal to feel this way under these circumstances? Do you think other people would feel this way under this circumstance? 99.9% of the time, it'll be yeah, because you're a human being in a world of other human beings. And then once you've done those two things, you want to ask yourself, what do I need to feel better? And this can be very internal, like reframing, like, well, maybe that person didn't mean that. Or what are some alternative perspectives? What's another story I can tell myself? What's an explanation for their behavior? It can be just reframing the story, or it can be as concrete as a bubble bath. It can be a self care. Like, you know what? I'm going to go get a really good, nourishing smoothie because I'm just way too overwhelmed about this right now. I don't know. I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. I'm going to go for a walk. It can be anything like that. I'm going to pet my dog, whatever works for you, but it's okay if it's internal. It can even be, you know what, just going to let this go. I see that come up quite often, but screenshot this. And I'm also going to attach it as a download so you can print it out and post it on the wall in your office or your bulletin board. So this week, action step time. Make it tiny. It could be something as simple as I'm going to try to practice the self compassion exercise one time. Okay. Or it can be I'm going to keep track of what my inner jerk most often harasses me about. Or at this time of day, I start to really beat myself up. Maybe it is when you're getting ready in the morning and looking in the mirror. I'm going to try to say something nice to myself instead. So take some time. You can even pause right here if you want. And or you can wait and fill it out in the journal prompts when you move on to the next lesson. But really take some time to think about how you want to integrate self-compassion this week. I can't tell you what to do, okay? Because it has to be right for you and your own unique journey and what you're going through. And if you have questions, you can always visit our LinkedIn group. You can see some suggestions other people have made, what's worked for them, action steps that they're trying out. And I or my associate coach are we're available there as well to answer questions and help you with insights. So next week, we have our last element in self leadership and our second to last module in self leadership. And we're going to be talking about self validation. So, in balance and out of balance, you would be a knower versus a learner, because this is out of balance versus in balance. A knower versus a learner, you may have imposter syndrome instead of experiencing self confidence. You may compare yourself to others quite often as a measure of your value, or you may just value your own authentic uniqueness. Or you may need a lot of external affirmation and validation. I'm someone who struggles with this. Or you may be a person who just can affirm yourself and recognize your own self worth without needing to hear it regularly from others. So, in summary, today, if you take away one thing and one thing only, self compassion develops resiliency. You guys, um, to get real with you here, all right. I After 7 years of marriage, found out my ex husband was gay. 2 years later, my little brother died of cancer, and the year after that, I had a stillborn baby. I also, in the middle of that, lost 90 pounds. Okay. Self compassion has changed my life. It's changed the life of my clients. If you take away no other module than this one, I believe can be the most life changing. So dig in, let it change your life, let it change your interaction with yourself so you can change your interactions with others and create the amazing work culture that I know you want to create. Thanks so much, and I will see you next week.